The two, we're gonna think he's talking about. G3 and. Form.
Okay, awesome. Everyone on Zoom, can you hear me okay? Just want to test the audio. If I can get someone to say yes or thumbs up. And can you also see my screen as well? Anyone on Zoom? You. No one is saying anything. Okay, someone just chatted. Yes. Okay, Jenny, thank you so much. Much appreciated. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to respect each and everyone's time. My real estate contract classes are typically about an hour. Sometimes we may go a little over depending if we have tons of questions. But this one is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm still getting a lot of agents, unfortunately, a little confused on this particular paragraph under the RPA, which is section 3G, as in George, okay? Now, you should always have the most current purchase agreement. The current RPA is the December 2022. So there was really no modifications done to the RPA last year, which is good. But just remember that there's always updates, modifications, edits to all of the purchase agreements twice a year. Once in June and once in December as well, okay? So if you don't have the latest, make sure that you always check and make sure you're updating the information, because on June, there's going to be some updates, and also on December as well, okay? So are we all clear on that? It should. But if some use the desktop, and for some reason, when you use the desktop, it doesn't, you have to manually do it. But if you do it online through CAR, then it usually updates it. I'm one of those old school guys. I use the desktop. Yeah. Yeah. I still go into the online because the online you can do a lot more. But when it comes to teaching, it's just faster, where if I don't need to be on the internet, I can just do it because it's already on my DocuSign, so, or my on my desktop, I should say. So, all right. So, and there's been some issues too with DocuSign as well, and some of the other signatures with connecting with our forms too as well. All right, so I'm very excited. So welcome. Good morning. Happy Friday, everyone. So again, I wanted to really dive deep into this paragraph and really get you to understand the elements and how this paragraph works, the do's and don'ts to this. So I'm going to bypass all this other stuff, okay? Because that is going to be a different conversation, and we can spend literally 3 hours just diving deep into the purchase agreement. But for today's topic, it's really just the sections, 3G, and the clauses that represent the SPBB form, okay? When you utilize this, okay? So let's just say you're in the trenches now, you're representing a buyer, right? And now you're ready to submit an offer. First and foremost, before you even submit an offer, what do you think you should have as part of your documentations with the buyer? Uh-huh, absolutely, a buyer representation agreement, right? Obviously, you want to make sure that if they're going a traditional way of finance, that they've been pre-approved too. Now, is it necessary for the buyer to be pre-approved and submit an offer? Does the buyer need to be pre-approved to submit an offer? The answer's, yeah, that's right. I was just testing you. You don't necessarily need to, like Brandon said, but you should, because a lot of agents are going to consider that as, did you do your due diligence on it, right? So in my personal experience and opinion, you always want to get your clients pre-approved or pre-approved or pre-qualified for their loan, So that way you know that you're not wasting any time, right? And that's vital and very important because time of the essence when it comes to these contracts. And I want to be very crystal clear with everyone. The goal here is to get your offer accepted, right? But more so is remember, new or seasoned, you want to double check, triple check before you submit it. Consider this like a resume, okay? And if your resume has a lot of errors, doesn't make any sense, and that is given to an employer, right? They're going to look at it, they're going to say, well, we're just going to put it aside. So remember that concept that you should always treat your purchase agreement like a resume and make sure you're very thorough with everything. And a lot of the things are not going to be pertinent to your purchase offer, but it's also vital and it's a must that you go through everything, right? Double check, triple check, and then obviously you can always send it to me. A lot of the agents, what they do is they send it to me as well. Simon, can I get your eyes on it, your opinion? I'll quickly go through it because I already, in my mind, I already know exactly what I need to look for, right? And I could say, well, this, or if I have any questions, I immediately call, hey, out of curiosity, this, is this, oh, no, it's an error mistake. Okay, I'll get that. And then they'll resubmit it to me again before they actually send it out. I want you to look like the professional that you are, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right, so let's dive into section 3, which is the terms of purchase and allocation of cost, right? And then paragraph G3, okay? And then we're going to also talk about it because the beauty of this purchase agreement now, it also illustrates the paragraph that the language is in there. Your answers are all on the purchase agreement if you know how to gather that information. Okay, and I'm going to show you how to do this. Now, if you look at the paragraph 3G, it says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement, which is card form SPVB attached. Seller brokers offer if any to compensate buyer's broker is unaffected unless otherwise agreed. Okay, and that is vital. It has to be otherwise agreed upon. Okay, if it's not agreed upon, it doesn't exist, in my opinion. It's no difference than an execution of the offer, right? When you have a buyer, you have a seller, you have an agreement, but it's not an acceptance until the final person sign off, if it's the buyer or if it's the seller. Okay. Now, I want to be again very clear in my position. If you don't have a buyer representation agreement, do not check this box off. Okay. Do not check off this box. I'm going to repeat it, and I'm going to repeat it throughout the hour as well. Okay. It is.
Just to clarify real quick.
Yes.
BRBC,
If you don't have, that is correct.
check this box.
That is correct.
Don't mind me asking this question, if I'm a listing agent and I get an offer, this box is not checked. What am I expecting, or does it matter to me as a listing agent?
You can definitely put that as part of your counter if you want as a listing agent. Hey, do you have a buyer representation agreement signed and executed? Okay. Because sometimes, and this is where I get a lot of confusion, all right? You only check G3 if you as the buyer agent have an agreement with the buyer on that buyer representation agreement. If you don't have a buyer representation, which a lot of agents unfortunately don't, then you don't check this off.
So
Leave it blank.
if it is checked and I'm a listing agent, I should also be seeing a copy.
That's, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay, Brandon, you're jumping 10 steps ahead of me, my friend. Maybe I should have Brandon come and help me teach this class. I love it, brother. You kind of remind me like Steve Gottlieb. Steve Gottlieb comes in here and we just bounce ideas and it's like very powerful. So thank you, Brandon. Yes, Ashley.
In terms of if you don't have that, essentially, And signing it is kind of like false pretense, and it's now like a.
No, not necessarily. Remember, everything that's going on right now with NAR, the settlement with Keller Williams, which again has nothing to do with what's going on in California, but we're seeing a lot of things back east right now, right? Now, sellers are questioning, why are we as sellers paying compensation to a buyer's agent when they're not representing us? It's their thought process. And this is where it opened a can of worms. And this is why we got into this crazy, ridiculous lawsuit type of a class action lawsuit because of that. So again, just to set the standard and the tone, we still don't know where this is going to lead us in the next 6 to a year.
He didn't understand it.
Mhm. And remember, once we get more information, the California Association of Realtors is probably going to have more documentation. When I started real estate back in the 90s, we didn't have all of these wazoo disclosures. I think at the time was like 4 or 5 was the purchase agreement. Now we're like at 16, 18 with the RPA plus disclosures. It's just bananas. Okay. But what's going to happen is in the future, we're going to have even more stuff. More stuff is going to happen. So you just got to prepare. You got to be part of that segue and just, be prepared to understand these contracts and how you present it to your clients. Okay. So are we all on the same page? And that also includes people on Zoom, that if you don't have a buyer representation agreement signed and executed by the buyer, then you're not going to check section G3, okay? Now, I'm going to go to paragraph 18, and then we're going to dive deep into that form SPB, okay? So if we go to paragraph 18, and I'm going to do a little bit of bouncing back and forth, but today's topic is just strictly that paragraph. Where is 18? Thank you. Okay, here it is. It's under page 11. Okay, and it says the following: broker and agents compensation, section 18A. Seller or buyer or both are in agreement to pay compensation to the broker as specified in a separate written agreement. Broker, that seller or buyer compensated payable upon close of escrow, or if escrow does not close as otherwise specified in this agreement between the broker and that seller or buyer. If seller agrees to pay buyer broker, see paragraph 3G3. Seller shall be entitled to a copy. This is your answer, Brandon. Seller shall have, excuse me, where I lost it. Broker identify compensates to pay. Where did I just lost my. Okay. Okay, thank you. Seller shall be entitled to a copy of the written portion of the compensation agreement between the buyer and the buyer broker. Identify the compensation to be paid. Then you'll say it says see CAR form SPB for further information. So what this is basically stating to the seller and the listing agent, hey, you checked off that. You checked off 3G. I want to see that document of what you and the buyer have as an agreement. Because if you really understand the elements of the buyer representation agreement, it says clearly that the buyer shall compensate the broker, the buyer broker. Okay. Now it's your discretion of what that looks like, because all commissions are negotiable, right? So you can put whatever you want. You can also say that the buyer is not responsible to pay me a commission, right? And put a 0 on there as well. But the whole purpose is to hold the buyer accountable, right? And the ability to understand that this is a mutual agreement between you and us as the buyer, that we have a written agreement. No difference than a listing agreement. When you go on a listing appointment, right? and do all of the work without having a listing agreement signed and executed? No, that's foolish, right? One, there's no guarantee that even if you find a ready, willing, and able buyer, that you're gonna be compensated, right? No one in the right mind should go and do that without a signed listing agreement, right? Well, it's the same when it comes to buyers. Well, these buyers are so intimidated about the paperwork. Well, to that point, I understand. And if you know how to articulate the conversation and really give them the value of why having this, then they'll feel more at ease to sign. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, there's a lot of even experienced agents that will not even touch the buyer agreement. You have built such a connection and a rapport with the buyer that you believe that they're going to be loyal to you. And for the most part, 80 to 95% of the time, it's true. I'm one that doesn't usually sign a buyer representation agreement because I know the value that I provide to the buyer. Brandon.
Well, I was just gonna agree with you.
Yeah.
Danny told me I needed one. I'm with you.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And it's okay. Okay. The problem is that yes, Tammy,
Is our Wellness Center making it mandatory?
not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. So it is part of the checklist, okay? But compliance and myself are not making it a commitment that you must. Now, the future is just around the corner with all this that's going on with that big lawsuit, right?
Would this be easier if CAR, or saying this is a requirement, and then obviously.
Yeah, then it trickles down to all of the states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. States where it's mandated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's changing, so.
Yeah. California is not mandated, but there's a lot of brokerages that are putting that as a requirement. That is part of the requirement, part of compliance, okay? Our office, it's not required, but again, that's correct. So I definitely recommend it, yeah. Because here's the problem that I see happen quite often, right? And I hate to use this term, but I'm gonna use it, buyers are liars, okay? Yes. Okay, the problem we see a lot is that the buyers unfortunately are not very loyal to us, right? And if we don't have any paper trail or documentation, then it's hard for me to really fight for you to earn a commission. This is the reason is the first thing I say as soon as someone complains to me is, hey, you know what? I want to go after this buyer. I want to go after that agent, who took my buyer. I get those quite often, right? So my question to the agent is, the first thing I say to the agent is, do you have a signed buyer agreement? I don't. I said, okay. Then I follow up. Well, why? Why? Well, I didn't think it was necessary. I thought I had a good relationship with the buyer. Well, obviously not. Obviously not. Because they ended up going with another agent, and it happens quite often, right? Where the buyers get influenced, they happen to go to an open house, they fall in love with the home. It's an experienced agent like Brandon and Tammy, and they persuade them, on their value, and that happens, right? And if you don't have a buyer representation agreement, it's really, really, really hard to earn a commission. Okay, my hands are up on that. We can have a conversation and see and hope that maybe the agent is willing to even give us a referral. And I've been successful with no buyer representation agreement, ladies and gentlemen, where I've been able to convince the other side to at least pay us a referral. I play that card of sympathetic position that, it's a new agent that, whatever that angle is. And they said, fine, look, we're gonna go ahead and close the deal with this buyer, but as soon as we close, we'll make sure to pay your office a referral agreement. And I've been able to do that successfully, but it's not guaranteed. And sometimes it's just a coin toss, folks. Yes, sir.
Kind of a two-part question, and that's, how many transactions do you think close in our area? There is no buyer representation.
I don't know the numbers, but it's high, very, very high. Yes.
Then knowing that, and you're a listing agent, and this buyer's been trying to put the deal with the buyer, for whatever reason it doesn't come together. Directly with the listing agent.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the representation or whatever it is. So that's one question for listing agent. Or maybe.
Absolutely. Right. That's right.
The opportunity maybe is knowing you don't want to do anything. Bringing the question up, how it just starts the conversation where even you can help the other agent.
That's right. And the way I look at, thank you, Brandon, for sharing. You're hosting an open house, right? Buyers come in and you give them the presentation, right? And you wow them. They fall in love with you, right? And one of the questions you'll ask the buyer is, hey, are you working with an agent? Well, I am, but the agent is not responsive. I haven't spoken with the agent in weeks or months. Then I do a follow-up question is, do you have an agreement, a signed agreement? I don't think I do. I don't think I do. So what is that going to put me in my position is that's a potential buyer for me. Okay. One, there's a disconnect with the agent, right? My job is not to say, well, you need to go to your agent, right? And try to work something out. No, my job is to earn the business. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask a lot of questions and ultimately see the motivation that the buyer has because I want them to work with me. This is the reason I'm doing the open house, right? Because I want business. I started my career with open houses. I didn't like cold calling. I didn't like door knocking. But what I loved and I had a passion and I was really, really good was open houses. I didn't have no business, but I started building my business just from open houses. And these were not even my listings in the beginning. These were listings from my agents, the agents that I work with.
Well, we
You know.
cold call. Business thing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. But that's, for most is if you have no business in one of the lead gens, start consistent open houses. Saturdays, Sundays, and stay consistent. I promise you, you're going to build that database of potential clients. And the beauty is you may even get a seller from it if you know how to cultivate those opportunities. Does that make sense? So in essence, and I hear it quite often is, well, what's the security that if I have a buyer representation agreement that I'm going to be paid a commission? Well, there's nothing guaranteed in life. All right. Because I've seen some crazy, crazy transactions where the buyer releases all of the contingencies, everything, then sends a cancellation to escrow, release the money to the seller, and in 24 hours, they send an email to escrow saying, oh, I changed my mind. I don't want to release my money after all. I want my money back. And the money stays in escrow, and the money stayed in escrow for several months until we compromise. Because remember, escrow is a third party, right? They're a neutral party. And their job is to listen to the instructions of not us, but the principals involved, right? The buyer and the seller. And if there's not an agreement or a meeting of the minds between both the buyer and the seller, so yes, then the money stays in escrow until someone basically says, okay, let's come to an agreement. And that's the craziness is like, well, everything is in black and white. The buyer released all contingencies. Isn't the seller able to get the money? Well, yeah, but remember, escrow also has to send an amendment of cancellation. Just because you sent the cancellation doesn't mean escrow is gonna release the money to either party. They still have to do their own cancellation to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So to me, when everything is in black and white, well, believe it or not, it's typically not. Because that situation occurred in our office and the buyer was able to get 50% of the money back. 50%. They agree, says, look, you know what? My money has been tied up in escrow now for 4 months. Look, let's negotiate with the seller and see if the seller is willing to release this. We'll release 50% of it. And the seller said, yeah, and the buyer was able, even though the seller was entitled to the full 3% of the deposit. Yes, Tammy.
The transaction until it's resolved, right?
Yes and no. Yes and no, depending on the circumstances, okay? This is how it works. Just because you have a pending escrow open doesn't necessarily mean that the seller has their hands tied. Depending on the circumstances and the scenario, right? Because the seller may be in the right to exercise their right to cancel. And if we have documentation that the seller did everything, right? Notice to perform and the buyer did not perform, that's your ammunition now to fully cancel. Even though the buyer may not agree, the seller has the right to cancel, right? And it's documented. Even though we have an open escrow, the seller has the option now to put the property back on the market, negotiate a new buyer, and negotiate the terms and open escrow. Now, how that works is very unique, okay? First and foremost, if you do have an open pending escrow, but you're opening escrow with a new party, one, it cannot be the same escrow company. That's a conflict of interest. You have to open escrow with a new. And this is, again, hearing it from the attorneys. Then you open escrow with a new escrow company, but you also have to disclose to the new buyer that it's subject to cancellation of the current escrow. So if this buyer comes back and wants to sue or puts a lease pendant, then we're not stuck with the new buyer saying, oh, well, you didn't tell me, now we're gonna sue you. Now you got a double whammy.
So the scenario really would be, if for whatever reason, there's a notice performed and to close. Technically, that's a unilateral cancel.
That's right.
To dispute, the buyer still wants it. Be a good example of the seller shouldn't probably contract with somebody else.
That's correct.
They're just finding a positive. Then the scenario you just described, like, as long as your I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and it's just only the deposit being released.
Right.
Then the seller could still go into contract with somebody else.
That is correct. Yeah, because the money's going to stay there until one, mediation, or we escalate it to an arbitration case. Mhm.
That's only the initial. We
That's
still-
correct. Yeah, and that's a different conversation. I know that's a different conversation, but I'll touch on that, Brandon. But thank you. Thank you for being very aware of it. Yeah. There's a section on the RPA. There's a two-part, the liquidated damage provision and the mediation and arbitration provision as well. I encourage you because the problem that I see a lot is that when you use DocuSign, it doesn't allow you, it doesn't automatically have it whereas it's an initial. So when you submit the offer, you're going to see that the buyer does not have an initial on those two paragraphs. So you have to manually add those as initials. Otherwise, you're going to submit the offer. Now, if you have a savvy listing agent, they're going to identify because remember, mediation and arbitration is a protection for all. It's a protection for all. We don't want to escalate it into an immediate lawsuit and get attorneys involved. Most of the disputes can be ironed out with mediation. And mediation doesn't have to be, a mediator at a cost of $300 an hour. Most brokers, I'm one of them, can usually de-escalate the situation by just calling the other party or getting the broker to broker conversation. That's the beauty of having an active broker that has your back, your interests, and the support to see if they can wiggle their way into resolving the situation. 80 to 90% of the time we can, as long as we have mutual agreement with the opposing broker and agent. I deal with it on a consistent daily basis. With this one I'm dealing with right now, it's the same thing. They're fighting over, it's the funniest thing, that our agent represented a client who's leasing out a residential house, and their standard is that they should receive their commission that same day. Well, the owner lives back east, and the deal just closed, I believe, yesterday. And the buyer's like, "I need my money already." Well, it's not that easy. There's process that we have to. We haven't even received the commissions to the office. We still got to process the checks, and then we'll send the commission. So I have to deal with that after our contract class. But again, it's like playing tennis, folks. It's the back and forth, back and forth. And obviously you have to be cool and collect, right? Because when you get too fired up, that can go sideways really, really quick, right? This is why you need someone as a second layer of eyes to kind of analyze the situation. And I come from a contribution where I see things differently, right? I'm not signing for you, but I'm not signing for them as well. I try to find the medium in all situations, that the ultimate goal is to either get it through the finish line, right? Or mutually have everyone cancel, that everyone is happy. The problem is sometimes agents are like bulldogs, and the egos get the best of them sometimes, and it's like King Kong. Well, that's not going to resolve anything. Okay. So you got to have an approach is like, okay, let's kind of analyze the situation and really dive deep on what the core of the situation is, and then nip it immediately, right? The problem I also see with a lot of agents is lack of communication. Okay, lack of communication. No bueno. Okay, communication is vital in your business, and you got to give the good and the bad and the ugly. We all love giving good news. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you just sold your home. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. Here are the keys to your beautiful home. We don't like giving ugly news, right? Oh man, the buyer decided to cancel. We got to put the property back on the market, right? Or, the ugly of the conversation. Shoot, we're scheduled to close today and the buyer backed out, or the buyer passed away, right? It's like, oh man, the ugly news, right? It happens. Nothing surprises me anymore. All right, so let's go back to the scope of the compensation, okay? So again, the seller shall be entitled to a copy of the portion of the compensation. So now if you check that, now you're saying to the listing agent, hey, I do have a buyer representation agreement, and that buyer representation agreement now falls under the SPBB form, okay? So if you don't have a buyer representation agreement, I just want to be clear, do not check G3. If you do have a buyer representation agreement, then you would check 3G. We're all clear? Any questions so far? Okay, so now let me pull that form. So let's just say that the scenario is that you do have a buyer representation agreement. Okay. So okay, so this is how the form looks. All right, seller payment to buyer broker. So if you do have a buyer representation agreement signed and executed, and you do put 3G, then you're going to get this populated. This automatically should populate as part of the required disclosures. All right, so basically it's pretty self-explanatory, right? The seller is basically saying, okay, you have a buyer agreement. What is the buyer willing to pay you, right? Because they can use that as negotiations now. Because if you put 2.5, right? You put 2.5 and you are listing the property on the MLS at 2.5, well, the seller can say, well, if the buyer is going to pay you, then why should I pay 2.5? Now, remember, there's a lot of scenarios based on that because ultimately, if the seller puts it on the MLS, what they're already saying is we are compensating a cooperating broker, right? And we as a buyer's agent could articulate that position saying, look, we submitted an offer, okay? We submitted an offer, and we also submitted the seller payment to the buyer broker, but you're also going to include what's called a CBC form. CBC form, okay? C is in Charles, B is in boy, C is in Charles, okay? That form, it should be part of your arsenal on a regular basis when you are submitting any offers to any agents. And again, that form is not utilized a lot. Okay? That form will protect you from a commission, and I'm going to explain how that works. Let's say, okay, let's say that you're searching the MLS and you happen to find several properties that your client like to see. Out of those 5 properties, one of them they fell in love and they ask you, Brandon, we'd like you to submit an offer. Brandon's going to say, wonderful, I'll go ahead and write it up. When Brandon goes through the motions of the MLS, he's going to see all of the details, right? All of the information that he needs in order for him to execute and draft the purchase agreement. Question?
Right.
Is there a question? 1 second, let me mute everyone. Okay, so yes. What is it? It's called it's cooperating compensation agreement. Yeah, cooperating compensation agreement, and it's broken down into sections, and I'll touch a little bit on that as well. So now that I have the MLS information, immediately, right, the agent is going to go where? What's the first thing they'd like to see?
Broker compensation.
Yeah, they want to see their commission. They want to know how much commission that listing agent is paying us, right? That's the first thing I check. Is like, okay, how much money am I going to make on $1 million, right? So, and that's all the way on the very bottom of the MLS, right? So once you have that information, and start being that professional that all of you are. And again, I don't see this quite often, but the problem that I've seen in the past is unethical practice. Okay. So you look at the MLS and it says that they're paying you a 3% commission. Wonderful. One, print that. Print that. If they're going to submit an offer, print the MLS that shows all of the information, including that section where the compensation, right? And the reason is remember, the agent can go into the MLS and modify terms and conditions. And I've seen this happen where the agent says, hey, we submitted an offer, but the offer we submitted was with a compensation of 3%. But then when we looked at the MLS and we got the escrow instructions, now they're saying it's only 2.5%. I went back to the MLS and I saw, holy crap, it's 2.5. I could have sworn that it was 3%. That's why, one, you want to get a copy. Now, the beauty of the MLS, it keeps history. Anything that the agent does, you're going to be able to see price adjustments, days on market, anything added. You'll see a time stamp on the MLS that if they change the commission, then you want to also keep that as record if you have to fight for a procuring cost claim. Okay, a procuring cost claim. Because you want to protect yourself, but you want to have all of your ducks in row. So if you do have to fight for your commission, you have everything, right? Because It's not what you say, it's what you can prove, right? And the proof is the documentation, the black and white that you have. And that goes to any type of lawsuit as well, right? It's not what I said, but it's what you can prove in what I have in writing, right? So the seller payment to the buyer is just one of those layer of documentations that you need. The CBC form will illustrate that you are going to submit that with the purchase agreement, the CBC, and if you have a buyer representation agreement, you're going to also include the SPBB form. And the reason I'm saying about the CBC form is because it puts clear, concise position to the listing agent when they received it. One, you're a professional. Oh man, this agent is on top of their stuff, right? But two, the beauty is you're securing the agreement of what you saw in the MLS. Now, the awesome part of it too, the CBC comes into work for you is you can also negotiate your commission. If the commission on the MLS shows a 2%, the CBC form can be that I'm requesting a 2.5 or even a 3%. So you can ask for more of a commission. How many people, when you submit the offer? That is correct. Yeah.
As long as the RPA, 3G check, and the BRBC and the CBC, you can get a DUI.
Pretty much. Tammy.
Ask for a higher.
No.
Well, Bill, I should have just said.
Yeah, what was interesting on that video is he
Really?
didn't even bring up the SPV or the CBC.
He did not.
It affects their position, like.
So I'm glad you.
No. And I'm going to explain why. Gov is unfortunately incorrect on that. And I'll explain it and I'll break it down to you. Okay. The CBC, remember, the commission is between brokerages. Okay. And I understand that if a buyer has signed a buyer representation agreement, there's language that says that the buyer would be depending, let's just say theoretically speaking, you charge 1% to the buyer, right? And it says there that, you know, if no one else pays you a commission, the buyer would be responsible to pay you the commission of 1%, you meaning the brokerage, all right? Not you directly, but to the brokerage. But there's also language on the buyer representation agreement that says that if anyone else credits you, that basically allows the buyer to be off the hook. Now, with that being said, let me put this very clear. If you say 1%, but the listing agent is willing to pay you 3%, right? It already says on the buyer representation agreement that if anyone credits you, then the buyer's off the hook to pay you that 1%. Then you're saying that the 3%, you as a buyer's agent are good with that. We're going to credit the buyer. The buyer does not have to pay me a commission. Okay. Now, let's do it in reverse. Let's say that you put 3% that the buyer's agent is going to pay you. But on the MLS and the seller is only going to pay you a 2%. Now the discrepancy that we have is 1%, right? Technically speaking, you are entitled to that 1% if you wanted to from the buyer to make it a 3%. Does that make sense? Okay. But you also have the option to say, look, I'm okay with the 2%. You don't have to, even though I'm entitled to that 1%, I'm not going to charge you. I'm good with the 2%. But you also have, let me go back. You also have the ability, if you get more in excess than what the buyer is going to pay you and the agent is going to pay you, you can also credit the buyer for closing costs or concessions. Yes.
What he said in that scenario. So if you have 1% in your buyer representation agreement, the other side is offering 3%, that 2% difference would automatically have to be, or you have to have it in writing.
It's not automatic. All right, so this is what, if we only got 15 minutes, if I have time, as soon as I'm done with this, we'll go into the buyer represent, and I'll show you the language, Brandon, where it says the credit aspect of it, because that's important. Because that's how you have to explain, because the buyer's not gonna know. Like, am I gonna have to pay you? Well, yes and no, depending on the situation. You have the control over this, ladies and gentlemen, okay? Remember, this is your commission. And I know it's a lot of moving parts and it's a little confusing, and I'm trying to just make it as simplistic as I possibly, but we're still gonna have questions, okay? In essence, this part of the seller payment to buyer broker is only utilized again for the purpose if you do have a buyer representation agreement, right? Because now you're fully disclosing to the seller, the intention of what the buyer is paying you as a compensation, right? Even though the listing agent knows that if they know that the buyer representation is also a credit, that if anyone else pays a commission. So if you look at the instruction aspect, all of the top here is all pretty self-explanatory, right? Property address, buyer, seller's information, all that fun stuff. Now let's go into the meat and potato of this conversation. Instructions. Only use this form if buyer and buyer agent have already entered into a buyer representation agreement. Okay? How clear can we be on this? If you don't have a buyer representation agreement, do not populate this form, ladies and gentlemen. Okay? It's only if you do. Part 2, buyer has an obligation to pay the buyer broker compensation pursuant to the representation agreement after first deducting any amount that the buyer broker will be receiving from the seller broker through the MLS or any agreement through the CBC form. See how all that's intertwines together?
Should it just all be on the same?
Yeah. 100%, Brandon. It would make our lives a lot easier. But the truth of the matter, it's not. It's a lot of mumbo jumbo paperwork back and forth. And the reality is they want us to kind of understand, man, let us just go work. We don't need the complexity of these legal terms, but the essence is we have no choice. And this is why you get paid good money to do this, folks. Make sense? Okay. All right, so then section 3 goes into buyer is asking seller to pay buyer's broker all or a portion of the balance due buyer's broker under this representation agreement. This amount shall be entered into paragraph 3. So the essence is what you're telling the seller is, hey, yeah, you know what? I have a buyer's agreement, and yeah, the buyer's entitled to pay me 2%. But I'm also saying that, because we're submitting an offer and because you're putting it on the MLS and because it's cooperating broker to broker, then I'm asking you, the buyer, to help me not pay my agent a commission. But I'm asking you because you're already offering compensation that you credit me that position. Okay, that's what it's saying. Seller may accept, reject, or counter this term. Holy moly. It's a negotiating tool now. Okay. And this is, again, one of those very unique situations that you got to be very clear and concise in your position and how you present this to the buyer. Because if the buyer doesn't necessarily have the money, then you still can have a buyer agreement, but you're not going to put zero on there, right? So that way now it doesn't fall and the burden is not on the buyer. And you can put zero as compensation. You have the buyer agreement because it's the agency relationship that you have with the buyer, but you're not charging the buyer and you have that right to do so or put some type of compensation. And the reason you have the buyer representation agreement, ladies and gentlemen, is for one fact and one fact only, is what if this property is an off market? This is a for sale by owner. This is not on the MLS. Then technically speaking, if the seller's being represented by an agent, the agent is not entitled to give you a commission. then that's where it falls back on the buyer to pay you a commission if the buyer wants this property. How bad does the buyer want the property? Does that make sense? Are we all clear on this? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Like you still have.
But-
RPA, so I'm reading.
Of course it does. Yes, sir. Okay, so again, this is a negotiating. Seller may accept. Seller may reject, or seller may counter this and say, look, you have an agreement with the buyer. Therefore, if the buyer's going to pay you 1%, I'm going to reduce the compensation, is basically what this is saying to the buyer. Okay, so be very careful in how you approach these agreements. Notice that the amount of the amount of rate of real estate commission is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiated between the seller and the broker. Real estate commission includes all compensations and fees to the broker. Okay, when they say all compensation, that means everything what is being provided by the seller. If that's 6%, 5%, 4%, 3%, that's what they're paying, then usually we have a share agreement with anyone. That's why we use the multiple listing service to share the listings, because we want more eyes on the property, so we get more offers, so we can give better terms to the seller. That's why we share our commission, because the commission is between the principal, the seller, and the listing agent. And then that is negotiated between the brokerage, the agent, and anyone that brings me a ready, willing, and able buyer. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's break it down now into the 4 parts here. I promise I will have you up by 11:30. Okay. Buyer representation agreement with compensation. Buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate the buyer's broker. And then that's the percentage that you're going to put. Whatever you put on the buyer representation, if it's 1%, 2%, 0%, 3%, whatever that amount, that's what you're going to put. It also gives you the option to put a flat fee, right? If you're not charging a percentage, but you're charging $1,000, $500, $1, $1. Okay, whatever it is. Okay, you put it on there. For the purchase of the property. Number 2, compensation from seller broker to buyer's broker. Okay, this is what it says, that it's between the seller, the broker, and the broker. It has nothing to do with the buyer. As of the date this seller payment for buyer's broker document is signed by buyer and pursuant to the MLS, seller broker has agreed to pay buyer broker. This is where you're going to put the amount that you saw on the MLS. So if it's 2.5%, 3%, you're going to put that as you're asking the seller to pay us a commission. Yes, sir.
So I work with the buyer. And, so you're the listing agent, you're offering 2.5%. It's listed for $1 million. The buyers are out of town. They come back a few days later, they still want to see the property, and then I realize maybe you reduce the price to $980,000, but you also reduce the co-broke fee from 3 or 2.5% to 2%. But because I have a written offer, are you still obligated to offer 2.5%, even if I bring?
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but I don't think so. If you have not. Yeah.
There's no reason for me.
If you haven't submitted an offer, then no. Then no.
It's the day I'm writing the offer and having the buyer sign it, I need to make sure I'm printing a copy of what's cooperating. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, yes. Because it's really when you, the submission of the offer. Because when you submit the offer and it says 3% on the MLS, then that's because, remember, everything is time stamped.
Sure.
Right? The minute that you submit the offer is time stamped, right? The minute you sign the DocuSign, right? Or put the date, it's usually time stamped, right? That's how you're going to be able to protect yourself if there's any shenanigans from the agent that they modify the commission, and that happens.
Yeah.
You know, the seller changes their mind. Oh, no, and they go in there, but they shouldn't. If there's an offer, then we technically have to. And it's funny you say that, because I'm actually going in an arbitration hearing in April on a procuring cost claim. Our agent did the same thing, and I'll share with you. The agent had it on the MLS for 2.5%. And then like 15 days later, she modified the commission from 2.5 to 2%.
Well, it's actually a code of ethics. violation When you do that, so we talk about it when we teach the negotiating class, we have a case study where we talk about when and violating ethics. Negotiating a fee after you've written a contract.
Yeah. And her position was that it was an honest mistake, that she didn't realize that it was supposed to be 2.5%. Yeah, so we have to go in an arbitration case, but most likely she's not gonna win the case, unfortunately. Not that, because it's a two-part complaint, is we want the difference of the 2.5, the half a percent, but also an ethics complaint because you promised this. Now, we have some ammunition on this that I think we're okay because we have an email from the managing broker approving the less amount. So with that, we should be able to not pay the difference, but
It's a standard, violation, that's 3.2.
yeah. So it's gonna be interesting on how that all kind of lays out, so. But I hope I was able to answer your question, Brandon. Yeah. Pamela,
What's the 2% more now? Rather than 2.5.
who's requesting? On the MLS, or you mean? Well, if you look at the MLS, it varies from city to city. There's areas that are still paying 3%. There's areas that are paying because again, it's a slower market. There's not a lot of turnover, so the enticement that they're trying to do is we'll give you more money if you bring me a buyer. So they'll push up to 3%, but in areas where properties are flying like pancakes, they'll try to negotiate a, 2%, yeah, 2.5%. Like the standard here in the South Bay is about 2.5, 2% is the typical what I see. And when I did I actually did a analysis of it, a 10-year analysis here in the South Bay, and it's always pretty much been around 2.5%, 2.5%. You'll get lucky if you get a 4% or even a 5%. And there's people that want to, dump that listing immediately, that they'll give you a 5% commission. I remember that happened to me. I was 2 years in the industry. It was a property in La Habra Heights, and I was calling to host an open house, and I saw it was 500,000. Now that home now is probably 2.2 million, half acre, beautiful tri-level home in the hills, and at the time was 500,000. But this was the mid-90s. But they were offering, because in that area they were not selling, so they offer 5%. And I thought 5% of 500, that's $25,000. That's a lot of money. So I was working my tail off, and thank goodness I found a buyer for it on my hustle. And I built that report with that agent because the agent was an out of area agent. Agent was in Orange County, didn't want to do the open house, so he gave me the opportunity. So I was there Friday, Saturday, and Sunday every weekend until I found a buyer and got my commission. So it happens, guys. All right, let's continue. All right, so number 3, seller payment to buyer broker shall not be greater than the amount in paragraph 1 checked, which is the inserted percentage or amount, which is no greater than the applicable percentage of the paragraph list, the percentage or amount. Number 4, buyer authorized escrow holder upon request deliver seller a copy of the portion of the written agreement between the buyer and the buyer broker, identifying the amount of compensation. Remember, transparency. So this is the authorization that the buyer is to have this as part of the escrow. And it's, again, it's our job as listing agents, right, is to let the escrow officer, because I know agents fail to provide, and the escrow officer is constantly, well, what's the commission, how much? And your commission may be different than the buyer's commission. You might be getting a 3% where the buyer's agent is only getting 2%. But you need to be clear with that when escrow, be on top of it, be proactive on it. Make sure when you send in an email, the executed purchase agreement, that you line up, all of the information, the buyer's agent's name, email, phone number, company, and all that, and then also what you're paying that broker. Make sense? Okay. And then number 5, if buyer broker is the same, if buyer broker is the same as the seller broker, then the amount specified in the MLI shall apply in the manner specified in paragraph 2.3. If the broker has agreed in the listing agreement to reduce the amount of commission, and that's typical. I do this quite often, and I'll say this to the seller, hey, you know, if they ask me an objection, says, you know, hey, Simon, are you willing to reduce your commission? No, I don't now reduce my commission, right? But this is what I'll do. If I do represent the buyer, okay, as a dual agent, meaning I represent you and I represent the buyer, then I will discount my commission by 0.5% or 1% for a total of X, Y, and Z. So if I'm going for 6 and then I'm willing to reduce my commission, then if I represent the buyer and the buyer successfully closes, then I'll reduce my commission down to 5%. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what this paragraph says. And then obviously the buyer and the seller sign this agreement. Any questions? Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to go over the CVC, but if you have any questions or the buyer representation, I want to respect each and everyone's time. I hope this information was vital for you. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. All right. Well, that concludes our contract class. Thank you. Thanks, everyone on Zoom.
Thank you, Simon.